Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. It's fun to give this clinic here on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. I see some familiar faces and some folks I don't know, so hope you do enjoy this this talk. This is something I wanted to share in honor of Father's Day. I sometimes say that I've been a model railroader for all my life, and this is photographic proof that I recently stumbled over. This is me at 2 or 3 days old, and my father presenting me with the locomotive for my Lionel train set. So many folks started with Lionel, but not too many started when they were 5 days old. I also like the cat watching. Clearly, that is still going on in my life as well. But I have been a model railroader for as long as I can remember, and one of my favorite aspects of the hobby is track planning, which for me sort of combines the fun of learning a lot about railroads and 3D chess, where you're trying to make things work in a variety of dimensions and for a variety of purposes. What I want to talk about today is a few things about what I think are the differences between a track plan, which we all have, and a prototype track plan. And the thought here is many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the idea of railroad prototype modeling, which is about usually about finding a particular car or locomotive, or sometimes even a structure, a town, or a scene, and trying to replicate exactly what one sees in the real railroad on a particular day and time, and in as great fidelity as you possibly can. And we can debate the merits of rivet counting and things like that. Some people think it's too much trouble, and some people think it's absolutely necessary. But I fall a little bit on the spectrum toward really enjoying the idea of trying to learn as much as possible about the prototype and to replicate it as much as possible in miniature. And part of the reason is that despite my early exposure to model railroads, I was never that much of a rail fan. And so while a lot of my peers in the model railroading community spent their teen years running around learning to identify locomotives and track freight cars and make friends with the dispatchers and yard masters and things like that, I was playing in rock and roll bands and learning a whole different field. So when I really got back into model railroading, I had a lot to learn about real railroads and how they worked, and so that's been a part of the whole idea of prototype model railroading for me, is that I figure if it looks pretty much like the real thing, no one can tell me I'm doing it wrong. So I've ported some of that over to the track planning aspect of the hobby, and saying that if your track is laid out as close as you can get to the real railroad, then no one can look at it and say, well, that's not right, or that's a mistake. So it's a sort of a defensive thing in general. But seriously, I've found over the years that it's a lot of fun to not only to look at the rolling stock and the scenery and the structures of a railroad, but to really think of the idea that the track and the track planning that goes into it as much as a model as any other part of the hobby. So the way I've come to sort of define prototype track planning is the reproduction in miniature of the trackage of a real railroad at a particular time and place. So we're putting it not only what it is, but where it is and what time it is during the evolution of a railroad, with the greatest degree of accuracy possible. We're emphasis on the word possible, because we all know that when we're trying to fit a railroad into an average basement, we have a lot of constraints on the space we have, the amount of access we can provide for a full-size human to get in and actually build and operate a model railroad, standards that apply to railroading, and even model physics, which are very different. They don't scale the same way that, that other parts of the hobby too. And as I alluded to, this comes from the idea that when we take things from the prototype, as Igor Stravinsky talked about music, he said, good composers borrow and great composers steal. So we are gleefully stealing everything we can find from the real railroads and using it to make ours more realistic and more fun. And I'm going to take you back in time just a little bit. I think this is really instructive about how track plans have evolved over a relatively short part of human history. And what was considered state of the art at one point, later on becomes taken over by a sort of a different approach to things, and it's led us to a state now where we're able to create plans for almost any space that provide not only good visuals, good look to our track plans, but good operating characteristics as well. So I'm going to start with a very famous railroad built by Frank Ellison in New Orleans, and this was started in 1934, so way back there in terms of model railroad history. And at the time, it was pretty revolutionary because it really did attempt to represent the operations of a real railroad line. And Frank would have very elaborate operating sessions with a lot of people taking different positions on the railroad, and some of which was governed by the electronics of the time and things like that. But we can see also that even on this very sophisticated railroad, there's a lot of characteristics we might not want to go for nowadays. For one thing, it really is a spaghetti bowl of track, and the main line is almost impossible to follow, certainly from this diagram, but it loops and it turns around, doubles back on itself, to the point that even if I tracked it right, one of these bridges, we have the line going, east to west goes this way across the bridge, and east to west goes that way across the other side of the bridge, which can be very confusing to operators. Access is blocked in many cases, not only by lift gates, but solid bench work. So one would certainly have to do quite the crawl to get into this inner pit. And once you're in your place to operate, that's where you would stay, as opposed to doing any walking around with your train, which of course was not easy to do with the electronics at the time as well. Obviously very successful, very emulated railroad, but shows what even the state of the art looked like in the 30s and 40s. Another obviously extremely famous railroad was John Allen's Gory and Defeated, well known for its scenic excellence, which some people would believe has hardly been matched since. John started building this version of the Gory and Defeated in 1954, and of course it very unfortunately was destroyed by fire in 1973, shortly after John died. And here we've got some interesting developments. This was wall around the outside, or dirt, since it was built under his house in the basement. But it does have a sort of a fairly wide access aisle that allows operators to come and walk in and get reasonably close to most of the trackage. Here again, though, we have the track looping around, in many cases doubling back on itself. So we have along here, for example, 4 parallel aspects of the same main line, right in the same point of view, and a lot of looping going back and forth, tracks crossing over one another, and things like that we might try to avoid these days. John Armstrong, of course, still considered the greatest track planner of all time. built this in his basement. I was fortunate enough to be able to visit a couple of times, and it was really was one of the first plans that epitomized the walk around idea, which was that wherever you were going along a main line journey, you would be able to follow your train, and giving you the sense that you're going somewhere from west to east on a prototype railroad or from city to city. And John pioneered a lot of things, including, the first or some of the first use of double-faced backdrops to sort of give you a sense that you were looking at one direction, this sort of spiral aisleway that would come from coming down the stairs into his basement. And the idea that you would, again, this was the central division point here of his layout, and then you would follow the river division this way around to the staging that was onto the central blob here, or go the other way up the mountain, looking the other way to the tracks that were up there. And so wherever you were looking on John's railroad, east was always to the right, west was always to the left if you were looking at the track, and that has been shown to give us a real good feeling of where we are and why we're going from place to place. Again, there are some things about even John's plan that we might think twice about these days. I've sometimes said that John Armstrong reminds me of Frank Lloyd Wright. The houses are really, really fantastic, but you never want to have to live in one. And for anybody who visited John's layout knows that some of these aisleways were as tight as 18 inches here, which could be a little tricky if you were trying to operate or pass anybody or anything like that, given the amount of railroad he fit into the basement, and how influential it was. I think we can give him some slack in that regard. This was O scale, by the way, as was Frank Ellison's. So a lot of railroad for a modest sized basement. Another very influential step was Alan McClellan's Virginian in Ohio, which was begun in 1962 and evolved somewhat as Alan built. But this was really opening up for operations even more, and we can see what we would call more of a linear plan that we're used to seeing these days, starting with staging on one end, proceeding again in a very consistent direction around, from lobe to lobe here, and winding up at a distant terminal over here. More room for operators. I think these squares are 2 feet wide, so there's a much more space for people to get around and do the operations that we like to do these days. From there, one of the first true double-deck railroads was Jim Hediger's Ohio Southern, which this plan was as of about 1980. Jim really was a pioneer in how to get that much more railroad into one space. I'm sure it was a very fun plan to operate and very, very influential. It has one thing that, and all of this is, I really try not to be a snob about any aspect of a track plan. It's your railroad. If it makes you happy, that's what's important. It does have something that happens on a lot of double-deck railroads, which is that the direction of travel changes from deck to deck. In other words, because of the positioning of the helix here, you're going, if you're going west, you're going left on the bottom level. You go around the helix and you come out and you're going the opposite direction compared to where you were in the bottom. It's an efficient way to plan. It means you don't have to bridge the doorway with a gate or a nod under, but it does have that unfortunate effect of sort of feeling like your train's going back the other way as you follow it along. Another very influential plan, Bill Darnaby's Mommy route, as of about 1992. This was a very large and very linear plan with very narrow shelves. And Bill's philosophy was sort of like when you're trying to rack up a lot of track miles to get yourself a nice long main line to do TT and TO operation, why make the shelves any wider than they need to be? In many cases, you're just trying to make the main line as long as you can, and it's going to be a, you know, for Bill, a sort of a Midwestern farm scene, and it's as long as you've got some spaces where you can stretch out scenically and do something fancier, why not make the bulk of your bench work very narrow? So Bill's bench work here is, you know, as little as 8 to 10 inches wide in some places, which is enough for him to get a couple of tracks and a line of trees or something in a backdrop, but allows him to get a very long main line into a basement-sized railroad here, especially when double decked as he's got it there. Then that, I think, probably translated very much when Tony Kester redesigned his nickel plate railroad in about 2000. Again, very long, narrow, straightaway type shelves here to give a lot of room for operation, a lot of room for running multiple trains and relatively long trains. And Tony was not, I don't believe, the first, but also managed to do this with no helix by doing what has now become known as a Nolix, which is a gentle long grade, so that by the time the railroad goes around its first deck, it comes around and is raised high enough to be over the deck. Actually, I'm going backwards because this is the top, I think. But anyway, without a helix, he's managed to achieve enough space between decks to not have to go through a helix, which, you know, helixes are in many cases a necessary evil, but they sure are more at home on a mountain railroad or something where you can hide them with tunnels and like that. So Tony didn't want to interrupt his journey with something like that and came up with this plan. Now, I really think that in a way we've gone beyond that, especially for smaller but still operation oriented railroads. And I've had the great fortune to visit Paul Dalkos's Baltimore Harbor District, which began in 2008 many times. And I've never seen so much operation in such a small area as Paul has. He'll just keep you busy all day in this relatively compact plan. And what he's done here is there is a very little main line. It's almost all interchange track, and there are 4 different railroads recognized in the space here. So plenty of room to do lots of operation, some staging in the back room to provide variety of rolling stock and things like that. But it's fascinating to operate there, and like I say, it can keep several people busy for a long time. And then another evolution, I think, is a lot of what Lance Mendheim advocates for what he does, which is, of course, heavy on the scenery, but this is the layout of his downtown spur layout, which is based on the prototype CSX in Miami, and lot of room to operate, but a lot of room for Lance's great urban scenery work as well. And one thing that both Lance and Paul have done that I think is very important, and it's so tempting to try to take our space and crush a bunch of stuff into it, but both of them obviously got out a measuring tape and figured out how big real buildings and real streets and real turnouts are and things like that, and just left enough room so that everything looks and feels just a lot more satisfying from a visual point of view than when we try to just crush too much stuff into too little space. So guilty as charged, but I do think it's a good lesson. So anyway, quite an evolution from the Delta lines in that time, and a lot of lessons we can we can learn from as we do our planning. So here are some of the tools and that I've found useful in doing prototype planning, and I'm sure you're familiar with some of them, but maybe there are a few that might help you with your own plan or looking at other plans, things like that. They include, of course, the online mapping sites, the track maps that one can get both online and at swap meets and things like that. Some things I've lumped under other resources. I have a set of calculators that are on my website that are based on Microsoft Excel I use them constantly when I'm track planning, and they might come in handy for you, and they're free, just $1, so you can download them there. And then of course the one question I get the most is about the software that I use, so I'll talk about that for a second. Back to online mapping sites, I suspect most of you have spent a lot of time going back and forth between these platforms. In case you're not familiar with any of them, of course, there's Google Maps, which is the default in many cases. Bing Maps still exists and actually has some features that have not been equaled by Google Maps yet, as far as I'm concerned. So I'll show you that. There is a function within Google Maps called My Maps, which can be handy as well. There's online sites where you can pull down the topographical maps of areas, which can fill in a lot of details, especially when you're doing something in a historical context where the real railroad has been abandoned and ripped up. And then finally, there's Google Earth, which is draws on some of the same data as Google Maps, but has again some different capabilities that can come in handy when you're doing the research for a plan. And it's interesting that it's one thing to go and look at a current railroad. It's quite interesting also to try to figure out, if you're doing something that's not present day, to try to track down the actual track layouts for those kind of railroads in the past. Google Maps, very sophisticated. It's gotten a lot more 3D. This you can see the roundhouse in Toronto that's part of the Toronto Railway Museum, and it's gotten startlingly realistic, that you're literally as if you're hovering in a helicopter a few hundred yards above what you're trying to model. It can be quite dizzying if you get out in the mountains and you're following a river or a track up a canyon or something, and all of a sudden you feel like you're suspended a quarter mile in the air and flying over the scenery. So be cautious in that regard, but obviously a fantastic resource for contemporary versions of the railroad that you might be looking at. And it's got tools built in, including measurement, which can be very handy. Bing Maps, a little different, some of the same data. One thing about Bing Maps that I've found useful is it allows you very quickly to look at north, south, east, and west of the same area. This is Little Ferry Yard up in New York City, or I guess New Jersey officially. But as you can see, as we go back and forth, you're actually seeing 90 degrees, and especially if you get a scene with like trees or shadows that obscure something you're trying to look at, sometimes the Bing map photographs will just be from a different angle or a different time of day or a different season, and you'll be able to see something that you weren't able to see otherwise. Google My Maps gives you some tools that I've found very useful. This is out in where the hell is it? Kansas, I guess it is, that I was working on a Missouri Pacific layout. And from the beginning, it looks just like Google Maps. I'm sure it's built on the same level of data and things like that. But it has some tools built in where you can, for example, put in your own listing of what you're looking at. So this was a set of towns along a route that I was researching for a layout, and you can see Pittsburgh was going to be sort of the center of this plan, but there was a town called Minden Mines over the Missouri line, and Liberal as well that I wanted to. Who knows if they had any liberals in Missouri? That was a side joke. Anyway, and other things that are available there in Google Maps. You can draw lines, which this is me drawing the route of that particular line. You can measure both very long measurements like this one using this little ruler tool. You can also, get down to the foot level if you're in a tight view, and if you're trying to measure a building or the width of a road or a river or something like that, you can get it down to accuracy of a few feet, which is really nice. Again, you just don't realize how big things are until you start trying to do a realistic track plan, and you say, I think we'll put a prototype version of that station in there, and then you realize, well, the station's 160 feet long. That's quite a bit of space, even in HO scale. So good to be able to get these benchmarks. Here's a topographical map. It's from my own research for my Ma and Pa railroad, and you can see the Ma and Pa, and this, I forget the year of this, but given that most of you know what Towson, Maryland looks like now, this is what it looked like at that time. And the Ma and Pa comes up here and crosses through and goes this way on up toward Bel Air. But when these are available, they can let you see not only the route, but they sometimes have some fairly detailed trackage drawn in, and certainly the streets and the structures and the general, if you want to take the time to figure out the topography and the what's going up and what's going down, which is of course not at all obvious from Google Maps, then you can get some of that from the topographical maps. I designed one railroad, and I had seen from the satellite view, a real neat little industrial park. And then I happened to go visit it, and it was actually, the whole thing was on a hill, and which made it a lot more interesting. But I never knew that by looking at it from Google Maps. Yeah, there's the Ma and Pa, and then finally Google Earth. And Google Earth has something that's, among other things, I haven't spotted elsewhere, which is at least some ability to go back in time with this little clock here and this timeline. This is a steel mill up in near Erie, Pennsylvania, actually, or Buffalo, I'm sorry. And the guy wanted to model it, and well, there's not very much left now. As you can see, it's mostly brownfield, or maybe we're trying to make it greenfield. Now these Google Earth maps, about the earliest they go back to is 1995, but even by going back to 2002, some of the old buildings were still there, and some of the track footprint you could start to see that had been pretty much obscured by present day. And then even further back, the tracks, the pictures get grainier and more black and white, but you can see even more locations and more buildings and more things popping up. So sometimes that's helpful when you're trying to track a layout that isn't present day. One thing that, like I said, can be surprisingly easy to look at current day maps and still see routes once you know what you're looking for. Right here, it's pretty obvious to see where the track went, because there's still sort of a fence line that follows the area that the tracks went. This is Erie, Lackawanna, I believe. And then also you can often spot roundhouses. Pretty obvious where that one was. There's some other track maps, or to shift, I should say, to the idea of using track maps for this kind of research. I'm sure many of you have sources that that I don't know about. Some of the ones that I've found most helpful are stashed on a website called Multimodal Ways, and the URL is there, and you'll be able to grab that from the presentation. It contains most of the ZTS, it's zone something system maps that Conrail had back in the 70s and 80s. So that can, it takes a little while to learn how to interpret them. And of course, the tracks constantly changed, but they still can be really, really helpful if you're trying to model anything that was Conrail back in the day. And there are spotty maps also on the same site from a lot of other roads. There's a map that the BNSF has online called the carload map, and it's a PDF, and when you first look at it, it doesn't look all that special, but you can zoom and zoom and zoom and zoom and get down to a pretty darn good look at what a route actually is. So I'll often, you know, when I'm scratching my head and looking at a town and seeing just the railroad lines on Google or something, I'll go consult that map to find out what's what, and has a lot of the short lines, and I think they keep it up to date. Obviously, hard copy track maps are often available from historical societies and swap meets and that kind of thing. This is an example of a ZTS map. It's from Hershey, Pennsylvania, which tier doesn't quite look like this anymore. They just recently have ripped up a lot of the track that used to serve Hershey Foods in downtown Hershey. But you can see not only the layout the way it was at one point, but also you know, these numbers go to a list on the next page that say what the purpose of the track was. So that can be really helpful in trying to figure out a prototype layout. These are a set of maps that are sent out by the Ma and Pa Historical Society that has certainly been a tremendous help to me as I plan my own railroad. They have there are 2 scale for the entire layout of the Ma and Pa from end to end. So it's, you know, 160 some odd, 8.5 by 11 pages, but really helpful in tracking down the Ma and Pa. Here's the carload map I was talking about. Like I say, and when it's in full size, you say, well, that's not very helpful, but then you start zooming in and it gets pretty tight, and you can start to see all these things. So if you're looking at an interesting town and you're trying to figure out which tracks are whose, I've found that this can be very useful. Then, of course, people have personal collections. This is a map of the railroads in Toronto that was about 6 feet by 6 feet, I think, when it came in, and it showed all the tracks around the Spadina terminal and the Union Station in Toronto. And I'll go through a track plan I did that vainly tried to push some of this into a guy's spare room at one point. And then there's a lot of other research sources. I suspect many of you have played with the frog rail tours, which they're spotty again. They don't certainly cover every railroad line in the country, but when they are available, they can be really helpful at interpreting what you see on a map, and they'll be full of a lot of detail about history and track patterns and industries and things like that. There is a application, and there is no justice because it's available for Android phones, but not for iPhones. It's called Rail Guide, and you can find it on Google Play. And those who come up to me after every time I give this clinic say it's really a really great resource. Unfortunately, I just can't get to it with my iPhone, but might be something you want to check out. I often wind up at Wikipedia when I'm researching a plan. They have maps, key details, industry information, history. There are entries, of course, on the major railroads, but also on many of the towns and cities that you might be trying to emulate. And then you know, picture sites like our picture archives. You can often you know, they tend to concentrate on locomotives and rolling stock, but sometimes you'll get a wide shot that really can help you understand a track layout or even copy it. And when all else fails, you can go to the library or museums or things like that. You know, you can take this as far as you want to. You know, there's certainly like you can go down rabbit hole to where you never wind up designing anything, but I found it's a lot of fun to try to get a real feel for a railroad, either a place I'll never visit or a time and place history in history that I'm trying to capture in a track plan. Okay, quick moisten here. And the cat's decided it's time for treats, so he'll probably join us here in a minute. I've developed a set of calculators. It's really just an Excel spreadsheet. It's free, just $1 at bobstrackplans.com. And I'm kidding about the $1, they're free. It's actually one file, and it covers curve and grade, train length, scale distance, degrees to radius, and frog angles. So here's, for example, the curve and grade calculator, and basically by entering the radius, the degree of curvature, or the number, the number of degrees that the curve turns, and the grade, it'll calculate the length in inches, the length in feet, and the rise in inches based on that grade. So it's real handy for for example, figuring out how tough your helix has to be to get up over top of itself, or whether you really have enough space to make that grade happen before it has to cross over another track or something like that. So I use that constantly. This is a generalized train length calculator, and up top in the green you can enter the amount of track that you have, and it will calculate a variety of train lengths based on how many cars and locos and cabooses you have in each case. So in this case, I've entered 17 feet 0 inches, and 37 40-foot cars will fit in that much space, but by the time you add a locomotive and a caboose, it's down to 34. And if you're doing 80-foot cars, 85-foot cars with an 80-foot loco, that's more like 15. Really good for estimating staging track length and that kind of thing. It also goes backwards here, that if you enter scale, car length, and number of cars, it'll tell you how long a track has to be to accommodate those cars. And there's a fudge factor in there for fouling points and that kind of thing. I wouldn't live and die by it, but it'll get you pretty close. Scale distance calculator. Again, if you are entering prototype feet, it shows you in your scale how many scale inches it is, or go backwards and enter scale feet in inches and find out how many, in other words, 6 feet 10, 6 real feet and 10 inches, and HO scale is 595 feet in the prototype. So that can be real handy for making sure things are the right size. Then there's also sometimes if you know that a prototype curve is so many degrees, they don't measure it the way we do. They don't do it by radius, because it can be pretty hard to have a string that long when you're laying out a prototype route. They'll measure it by the turn by degrees. So I've done a calculator here where if you enter a curve by degrees in the scale, it'll tell you what the radius is in inches, or vice versa, enter the radius in inches, and you get the degree of curvature that the prototype would use. So if you can, if the prototype says it's a 4-degree curve, you can type it in here and see what it's supposed to be in your scale, and you could be amazed at how tight prototype curve is still a lot of inches in your scale. I always find it handy to have frog angles as degrees, and there's also I think there's one more that I've built since then, but I can't remember what it is right now. Anyway, so to the question of software, I'm not your authority on track planning software. I started using a program called MacDraft Pro, which is a fairly simple, intuitive, and relatively inexpensive drafting program, 2D drafting program. It is available for PC if you're not a Mac user. I can't vouch for it because I've always used it on a Mac. The good news, like I say, it's pretty full featured for a CAD program, and I certainly use it for a lot of drawings of buildings and other things like that when I have the need to design something. Goes from scale to scale very, very easily, and like I say, it's pretty easy to use. Bad news is it's not a model railroad specific program. So if you're looking for something where all the you've got a grab bag of turnouts and curve templates and things like that, you have to build your own. Although I'd happily share the ones that I've done, but if you happen to be a MacDraft user, but you have to put up with my idiosyncrasies for how I do it. It's also a 2D program. It does not generate 3D renderings, and doesn't do some of the things that Third Planet and some of the other systems do, like allow you to run a train on your railroad and see how it works. I tried Third Planet. I gave it a good try. Unfortunately, I'm an inveterate Mac user, and despite what they tell you, it is not stable on a Mac. I tried several different emulators, and it would not only crash repeatedly, but it would swallow everything that I'd already done. So I couldn't even start over. And after a few weeks of giving it the good college try, I went back to what's familiar for me. So I recommend MacDraft for what it is if you want to jump into it, but don't expect it to guide you through the process of designing a model railroad. Okay, so I've talked a little about what I think a prototype track plan is, the characteristics to give you an idea, and I'm going to step through some of these with some plans that I've done and show you what I've tried to accomplish in that case. First off, as I said, it's the recognizable depiction of a real-life railroad route at a point in time. This is a plan I did for a gentleman named Craig Snyder, and it was the very famous crossing of the Cascade Mountains by Union Pacific. It was originally, if I'm not mistaken, Southern Pacific. He wanted to do it in the Union Pacific era, and he had modest size room, but praise be, he's in scale, so you can fit a lot of railroad into a relatively small room in scale. So again, the goal was to replicate this as close as we could, and fortunately, he was up for some aggressive multi-level track planning, and that's what we did. So if any of you are familiar with this route, it basically starts in Eugene, Oregon, and goes in a southerly direction toward eventually down toward Oakland and further south in California. Crosses a very high range of mountains in doing it, and it's got a unusual feature there that Craig wanted to capture if we possibly could. So here you see a bottom staging level for Portland, and I hope this is coming through enough that you can make out the details, because it is intense. A yard representing Eugene, and then here we're following to the left as if we're going south, and we start going up into the hills across the Willamette River, and here, and then that's the lowest level, and it goes through I think only need a one-turn helix in this case, because we've already attained some altitude. Crosses the door on a swing gate, continues to Oak Ridge, which is a little industrial town, and a lot of this, it's not a precise layout of Oak Ridge, but it sort of captures it, I think, in a good way, and then heads up into the hills. And the famous thing about the route here is that it changes direction, and this is something that we're always trying to avoid doing in our track plans. Well, the Southern Pacific did it in real life, and they did it to attack this very steep grade in the southbound direction. And basically, in the real thing, the railroad goes turns around, goes or goes southbound, turns around, goes northbound, again paralleling the original route a little bit up the hill, turns around again and goes back to the south that way, all in the space of a few miles. So if you're familiar with this, you can stand at the bottom and look up and see trains all going southbound, going in opposite directions on different levels of this all at once. There are, I believe, 22 tunnels in that same stretch of space. So it's kind of made for model railroading in the sense of giving us a lot more main line in a short area with lots of tunnels and prototype semicircular tunnels and things like that, all true to the prototype, and a great way to model a very spectacular scene. And then this one finally winds up crossing over, going, by this time it's overhead height, and crossing over to Cascade Summit and to a staging loop for San Francisco. So again, it's prototype and a very distinctive area. Here's sort of a cutaway of how the different levels look to a viewer. Okay, a second characteristic of a prototype track plan is that it facilitates the operation in a manner of a particular prototype. This was a gentleman named Jeff Yost, wanted to do the second subdivision of the Erie-Lackawanna out in Illinois. And, we all have our crazy ambitions. His was to replicate some of the really crazy interchanges and crossings that happen in that part of the Midwest. And I want to spotlight a town called Griffith, which was pretty famous. And I was able to, certainly not, the whole thing doesn't work, but all the tracks are there for the prototype crossing, which looks like this. And if you can see, it's 3 double track routes crossing each other, but in the distance there's another set of crossings there, and a road going right through the middle of all of it, along with a sidewalk. And you'd really have to have a death wish, I think, to spend much time on that sidewalk. But Craig wanted to build this thing, and so I put a design in place for him. And one of the problems we often have is things like crossings and interchanges and Ys take up a lot of real estate. So given that the operation was going to be fairly occasional, this area here was on a drop leaf, and then you could see it was possible to run a train across the diamonds from staging to staging, just to cause the dispatcher some headaches and do some real live interchange with at least one of the routes there. So I'll leave it to Jeff as to building all the crossings and everything. This continues to a second level, and it's got some characteristics similar to Bill Darnaby's route of giving us a very long main line for spacious basement, and had a little nook over here which was just perfect for putting in a staging loop, so I did. I've talked several times about the importance of giving a sense of direction and location and orientation, so you know where you are and you know where you're going. This is one of my greatest hits. I think a plan that was done for a gentleman in Switzerland, actually, and he asked that we do a plan for the Western United States. And so I scratched my head and looked around a bit and found the Cascade and Columbia River Railroad, which is a short line that branches off from the Burlington Northern, the BNSF in eastern Washington State and goes up actually into Canada from there. And I mentioned also the problem with some double level pikes, in that you tend to come off a helix going in the opposite direction as when you went in, just the way the geometry works out. In this case, we sort of make it work to our advantage. And let me show you what I'm talking about. The BNSF here is shown going from west here around the corner through Wenatchee, Washington, and on to the to east to Spokane here. And there's staging down underneath. So it's on the single level, it's just the BNSF loop. And then the junction for the branch line heads off. Oh, I'm sorry. The branch line heads off here, just north of one. I'm misspeaking. This is the branch line here. The BNSF continues this way back into staging. The branch line heads off this way to the north, as it should, and it's paralleling the green. There is the river, and it, you know, you always sort of feel like you ought to be standing in the middle of the river looking at the track, I think. So up to this point, we're going north is to the right. And then what happens though when we come out of the helix, north is now to the left. Well, the only thing is that on the prototype, what happens between Wenatchee and Okanogan is that the tracks cross the river. So up to this point, and I've got, there we go. Up to this point, and this is north this way, so you can see the BNSF coming that way into Wenatchee, and the Cascade and the CDCS heading off to the north. So again, we're standing in the river, we're seeing it go off to the right there. And then a little further up the way, guess what? It crosses the river. So if we can use that point to say we're still standing in the river, but now north is to our left. And that's what happens on the second deck of the CDCS plan, is that, which I think I have here. Yeah. So this is after you've crossed the river, and now north is to your left. And we've used that to advantage, and it goes up through Omak and eventually to Oroville in Washington State. And unfortunately, Laurent moved before he could ever build this thing. So we'll never know, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. A prototype track plan uses believable scaling and compression. I think this is really important. I mentioned about, you know, my admiration for the way Paul and Lance pay attention to how big things are in the real life, because there's some things we can compress, and we certainly need to. Even on a prototype track plan, we certainly can't, at least for most of us, use prototype curve radius, the length that a straightaway is likely to be, the sharpness that a turnout is likely to be, train lengths. You know, prototypes frequently running 100-car trains plus, and we feel pretty good when we're running 25 or 30. And, you know, a structure, we can't compress we can compress the extent of a structure. In other words, if it's, you know, deep and we're just showing the front end of it, there's really no problem with cutting off the back if we're not interested in it or something like that. But there are a set of things that can't be compressed on any railroad, on any model. The length of one car can't really be compressed. And that means, coincidentally, and I had to learn this the hard way, loading docks have to be spaced to the same degree that they would be in a prototype railroad. Otherwise, your cars aren't going to fit. Same with the spurs for any given number of cars. You can't make a spur shorter and expect to get the same number of cars that the prototype would get on them, or anything like that. And the same thing with the length of your passing sidings or your staging. For a given train length, if you've got a 25-car train, the siding has got to be the same, the length that it takes to accommodate that. You can't just arbitrarily reduce the length of a siding. The width of a car is similarly can't be compressed, and that means that parallel track spacing and clearances have to be basically the same they would be, or even a little bigger than they would be on a prototype railroad. So you can't compress that. If you do, you'll find out to your horror that your railroad doesn't work. Another thing that can't really be compressed is the length and width of automobiles and trucks. And I think one thing that I'm always really impressed when someone's been able to use the prototype width of a road, because it just looks a lot better to have the amount of space around a road that or around a car or a truck that a real railroad would. Same with truck loading docks. They've got to be big enough to accommodate a truck. And if you are on a modern railroad and you're doing a 53-foot trailer, there's a lot of space that it takes to load and to get a trailer in and out. So all of that stuff, some of it you can fudge just a little bit, but it certainly looks better if it's right. And another one that's sometimes forgotten is the angle of repose for scenery. In real life, unless you're really talking about El Capitan or something, even the steepest natural dirt hills tend to be no more than 45 degrees. And we're very guilty frequently of having 90-degree cliffs between adjoining tracks and things like that. It just doesn't look right. So always good to make sure you're leaving enough room for that. I think you can fake it a little bit when you're looking straight on to a scene, because you can't really judge the sharpness. But if it's to be seen from the side and you've got a cliff, it's gonna be very hard to scenic realistically. So again, things that cannot be compressed. And what can be fun is to not compress things. This is a plan I did based on a town called Coburg, Ontario. And this is a map of the real thing. And you can see that it's got an old-fashioned CN station. This is Lake Ontario is a mile or so in this direction. It's got an old-fashioned kind of station, and then they built a more modern commuter station, which is long enough for a real passenger train there. And but this in a modest size sort of bedroom size space is kind of doable in HO. So we're able to do this full size and really get a feeling for that town. And we had to, the prototype's pretty straight through here, and we had to do some bending to get it around and fitting in this relatively small room. But the town itself and the station scene ought to be pretty convincing, because it's nice and straight and full size, and the roads are full size and that kind of thing. Finally, I wanted to touch on using prototypical track design principles. I could know a lot more about this than I do, but I do a lot of observing when I see how does the prototype lay out the switches and the curves and things like that. And there's certainly a prototype for everything, and I have become something of a connoisseur of really weird prototype track layouts. You fly right over this when you're going into O'Hare Airport occasionally in Chicago, and I love how they have this factory here, and they had some kind of lake there, so they just built the track right around it. It looked a little awkward, but that's how it works. This would be a nice industry, I think, for somebody. This is in south of Eugene. I discovered it when I was doing that plan I showed you a minute ago, and I don't know what the heck this factory is, but it's got this bizarre set of industrial tracks sunk into the asphalt, and they must have some kind of critter that drags cars in and around it. But I'd love to get somebody with good fast track skills to build that at some point. This is one of my favorites. It's out in the Midwest somewhere. It looks like somebody's really lousy 4x8 railroad, but it's clearly a pretty modern grain loading operation where they just take the cars around the big loop. It looks a little bigger than 18-inch radius, but pretty strange to look. You've all probably seen this on social media. This is a turning Y for locomotives, and it takes quite a number of moves, but they just ran out of space apparently for a real Y. I love this one, old timey, that I came across, and It's got looks like a dual gauge track running right through the middle of a dual gauge track switch. So I challenge someone to build this and have it operate, and wiring it would be no picnic either. Probably best if your locomotives are on battery. It looks like the switch here is a stub switch too, which will be another picnic. Here's a good one. This is some kind of ore loading operation. Another 4x8 up on trestles all the way. So that would be quite a project to build. This one I haven't quite figured out yet, but anyway, I'd love to see someone make that work. But oh yeah, and then of course, if you don't maintain your track, get a little shrinking in the summer or something like that, you might wind up with something like that. Oh, and this is my all-time favorite because I shot this one myself, and this is on the CSX main line near Jessup, Maryland, and this is a spur that they were obviously in the process of taking out, but Walthers must have been out of right-hand turnouts or something, because they put in or left-hand turnouts, because they obviously put in a right-hand turnout to temporarily connect these tracks to one another. So that would be a detail for the railroad. Anyway, yes, there's a prototype for everything, but as with so many other things, we get a lot better prototype look by modeling what's typical and leaving the outrageous to being something that we don't go for very often. So a couple of principles that I've noticed, and one is that the prototype will go to great lengths to run the most used track through the straight side of a turnout. Now, we might be tempted to do something like this, where red is the main line and blue is the siding or the spur. But it would be very rare to see something like that on the real railroad. They would much more likely let the turn straighten out and then have a turnout where the diverging route was through the curved side of the turnout. And I used to think this was just to avoid derailment, but actually a buddy of mine, Tom Deviney, as some of you may know, who's a real life engineer, says it's all about wear on the turnout components, that there's a lot more wear on the curved side of a turnout than on the straight side. And so the railroads will again go to great lengths to put the straight side on the straight part of the turnout on the most used route instead of the lesser used route. The problem, of course, from a design point of view, is that this takes up more space, but I still go to a fair amount of trouble to try to avoid this kind of thing. Now, of course, as soon as I say that the prototype would never do this, who does do it in several spots is the Ma and Pa. Of course, worrying about things like good operation was not the Ma and Pa's forte. So I'm modeling it just the way the Ma and Pa did it, and enjoying the extra space. Very similarly, if we had, for example, a passing siding and a spur, we might be really tempted to do an operation like this. The prototype's much more likely to do this. Not only do they put the passing siding through the curved side, they then will continue and put the spur through the curved side of the next turnout, even though it takes a lot more space to do that. Same reason that they don't want the wear and tear that would occur from running the trains through the curved side of the turnout in most cases. So don't always have to do it. And, if it means you can fit in 3 more industries, more power to you. But if you want it to look right, you might want to think about doing something like this. Plus, it's cool to see the trains sort of snake their way into a spur that way. Same principle at work here, going from a double main line to a triple line, or a line with a siding in the middle between the main lines. We'd probably think nothing of doing it the way I have it drawn there. The prototype, to get things through the straight side of the turnout, would do something like this. Actually put the one turnout on an angle that's a little less than the turnout frog angle actually is, and then straighten it out that way. so that the main lines are going again through the straight side of the turnout. Now, you know, in a prototype railroad, of course, these curves are all relatively gentle, but it looks a little weird, but it is the way I see it almost all the time when there's a track arrangement like that. So point being that looking at the prototype can be a lot of fun, and it can help your scenes look typical. Here's an example of pulling a prototype, somewhat unusual track layout from the prototype for a fellow named Mike Stein, who was doing a Conrail layout based on Lockhaven, Pennsylvania. And you can see here that the route, the main route for the turnouts here sort of goes in between, even though these are right up next to each other. This is the way the prototype had it laid out. So I enjoyed picking up on that for Mike's layout. Okay, so I've been through some of the overall principles that I try to do, my research, and some of the techniques I use. I wanted to sort of walk you through one of the plans that I did and show you some of my process, because it's a very holistic sort of approach to fitting all this stuff into a space that's never as big as we want it to be. I have a questionnaire that I started, and I stole most of it from John Armstrong, added in some stuff that I thought would be helpful to me, and was up to date. And this is from a gentleman named Mark Goldstein, who lives in Missouri, and wanted to model the Toronto terminal area of the Canadian Northern. And so it's got some of the basic questions that try to get at what does he want to accomplish in this space. And the space, which is the next thing I ask for, this is Mark's diagram of the space that he had available, which was by no means huge for what he was trying to accomplish. It's not a bad railroad room, but as you can see, it was only 10 feet wide for the most of its length, got a little wider here, and had the doorway in the corner there. So this is what we're dealing with now. Frankly, this is one of the best diagrams I've ever gotten, and it always amazes me that some of my clients who would probably, you know, argue over whether you know, an eye bolt was a quarter inch too close to the side of the locomotive, will send me a diagram with, you know, oh, it's about, you know, 40 feet this way and 23 feet that way, and then I have to deal with it. It's really important to know very precisely where everything is, and things like hatches and windows and doors and things like that, to be able to use a room to its full value. So this is me drawing it up in my program, laying it out and putting in some rules to show the size in feet in the doorway. And this is what the kind of thing that Mark wanted to replicate. This is really only half of the Spadina terminal in Toronto, and you can see how complicated it was in terms of being a real life passenger and freight terminal. He was eager to do some fancy approach to the Union Station. He wanted to replicate, certainly not all, but some of this. And he had these very helpful diagrams to give me a sense of just how crazy he actually was, no, a sense of what he was actually trying to accomplish. He also had some beautiful drawings that did the whole line out to the east from, or to the southwest, really, from Toronto down toward Buffalo and Niagara. So really wonderful track diagrams that we could work with. Obviously, we were going to have to be very selective about what went in and what didn't. Here's a junction that's part of it as well. And then, you know, he sent some photos which, you know, were historical, really gave me the sense of, you know, this is the 4th of July there in Toronto. So it gives you a sense of what he was trying to accomplish in terms of look and feel. But again, you know, this is really helpful. I've been to Toronto, but not recently, and not with the time to really rail fan. So So this was very helpful. And then I started looking at the Google Maps, and this is a part of the current day approach to the Union Station, which is not too different from the era that Mark wanted to do. And you see it's all full of double slips and crossings, and he wanted enough of it so it would pick up the feel of Union Station, but obviously something that was buildable in his lifetime. This is one of the junctions. A lot of the traffic on this line is commuter rail, and so this was a junction to one of the subsidiary lines with the main lines down at the bottom. This is a more suburban area. These are the tracks, going through a commuter type station, and a lot of parking. This is Oakville, Ontario. Then there was also some industry along the way, some nice industries along the main line. So we wanted a little bit of that, even with all the emphasis on freight or on passenger. And then there were some some nice pastoral scenes, Bronte Creek and the main line going over a bridge there. He wanted to see if we could work any of that in. So I said, and this is sort of the end of that segment where I think this heads off toward Buffalo and Niagara, and this goes toward Hamilton. So this is, maybe 10, 12 miles out of Toronto, probably a little further, probably more like 20 or 30. But anyway, so what to do? First thing is to do a little scoping, get an idea of what will fit in this area. Well, I certainly didn't want to go any lower than 30 inches as a minimum radius for a plan that was really going to emphasize passenger. And on the other hand, to get anything at all in his space, I didn't think I could go much bigger for a minimum radius. So I started by drawing a 30-inch circle that you can see here. And then, of course, a lot of the line was double track. So we'd add another circle with a 2 or 2 1/8 inch spacing to make sure we had enough room for that. Then I usually like to allow 3 inches to allow the trains enough space to fall off the tracks without subsequently falling on the floor. So that gets us to 31 or 35 inches. And then we imagine sort of a minimum 2-foot aisle. Really hate to go any narrower than 2 feet on an aisle, even for one person. So that brings us to 4'11". And then I draw a circle even bigger than that. And probably if you thought about it for a minute, you'd realize that that's where we could put the centerpiece or the center point of another circle just like this and maintain our 2-foot aisle in between. So in other words, if I duplicated this and put the center point there, we'd still have a 2-foot aisle. So that helps you sort of figure out where the blobs, the turnback curves and things like that can possibly go. Well, we see from this one pretty quick that if we do that, there's not space for even one turnback curve in the middle of the narrow part of the room. It's just too thin, even with squeezing a little bit, to have any bench work on both sides of that. So that wasn't going to work. The logical place to put any kind of turnback curve was going to have to be in the wider part of the room, and there really wasn't room for even a second one. So that was sort of dictating a lot of the shape of our plan right there. That's just sort of where any kind of turnback had to go. So I'd start drawing some typical aisle or typical bench work rectangles here, very rough at this point. We see we can have some of those narrow Bill Darnaby kind of foot wide, 8-inch wide shelves around here to give us a lot of room for our main line. But we quickly find a problem there, which is that even down here where we'd want to have, for example, the main line coming around this way and going around the circle and going that way, well, we don't have room to even do that without putting them in a tunnel, which would be really not prototypical. So I scratched my head on this for a few days. And then there was another factor, which was that, again, Mark wanted to do a representation of a big city passenger terminal. I cut it down to 6 tracks, but by the time you put space for platforms between them and any kind of throat, it's about that big. So we're going to have to figure out where that goes, as well as all the rest of this stuff. So that kind of had to go there. The real terminal, of course, is double-ended, but he's got a door. And there was really, I had some dreams of doing a double-ended terminal, but that wasn't going to work. So Toronto became single-ended, but there is barely enough room to get a representation of the station with tracks long enough to handle commuter trains and maybe a through train or two and a yard through there and still make a curve. So what if we did this on the upper level, and that gives us a curve to get us out there. And as you can see, we're assuming that west or down toward Hamilton and Niagara are this way. And then we went toward a helix there, and then did sort of a place where the lower track, the lower deck actually went under the upper deck and continued around this way. So this is going to be underneath the tracks on the upper deck. It's not really a full double deck layout. It's more of a sort of a partial mushroom, I call it, or a sliced mushroom or something like that. So that the tracks in the middle, if you're standing here, you're looking that way at the main, and if you're standing up here on a raised floor, you're looking that way at a main, and you're not seeing them both at the same time. And that became the basis for this plan. Needed some pretty hefty staging to feed a terminal like that. So the nice thing was that this could fit pretty well under that passenger terminal, but we did have to allow enough space to have a return loop. And as things continued to develop, I found that I could squeeze in some industrial trackage there as we get out into the suburbs here on the lower level. A fake junction there to the one that I showed you in the with the some tracks going to Buffalo and some going to Hamilton. And in that big spot that was required by the return loop underneath, well, we had to have at least one turntable to show all to represent the Spadina terminal look there. So a little bit of a coach yard, a little bit of freight yard, and some room for locomotives and manipulation. I also said, well, let's fake one of those junctions right here, and at least we can have it on substandard radius go into a helix and disappear in the other direction down here, so we could at least stage a couple extra trains there to give us some more traffic into the station. And that's sort of what it looked like when we finished up on the upper terminal, or the upper level, and this is the lower level, so you can see how there were some a representation of Oakville with the commuter terminal there. There's Bronte Creek with the bridge. There's another commuter station to give us a place to stop. We did have to put a kind of an awkward curved bridge over the doorway, but you always got to have some compromises. And then I did put a nice access hatch because it would be really a problem to reach anything that was derailing over in the corner here if this was the closest you could get to it. So it's a lot of railroad for a relatively small room. You wouldn't want to have too many operators, but I thought it did a pretty good job of capturing the prototype, and it did wind up in Model Railroader, and you can see it there on their track plan database. So that's sort of where it all has gone. So I can either stop for questions or a break. I've not been monitoring the chat, or I could run you through some of the plans I've been working on recently. Anybody got any? Let's see what the chat is saying here, and if I can answer any questions. Yes, John was very tall and very skinny, so he could negotiate aisles that some of us would have had trouble getting through. Paul Dulcas's railroad, not only is it around, it's more or less finished, and it's a beautiful piece of work. Great track plan in my estimation, but Paul's scenery is hard to imagine, hard to match by anybody. Okay, I got some good things to look at. There's another great look. Another great mountain loop that I wasn't aware of till fairly recently, and it's on the Norfolk and Western in North Carolina, approaching Asheville, and it's a very sharp, very steep curve. Name will come back to me in a second. Maybe somebody knows that. Looks like you can get pretty close to it in terms of seeing it. In fact, there's a hotel right in the middle of it. And yeah, that's a good question on from Gil on the I think the narrowest aisle, I could be wrong, I'll go back to it, is yeah, they're pretty close to a little less than 2 feet, aren't they there? Again, compromises. There's not going to be any operators passing each other there. There are some spaces in the corners, and you know, for Mark's preferences, he'd rather have the long main line, and was mostly going to be operating by himself. So very good point. No, I'm not talking about Saluda. I'm talking about it'll come to me. Well, if anybody would like to see it, I have a couple others to show you that I have been working on. This one I'm pretty pleased with. This is a gentleman who was really wanted to build replicas of the bridges over the Mississippi River on what used to be the Sioux Line, and had a decent sized room, one that had a variety of low ceilings in it that I had to pay attention to while I was designing. But I think, again, we came up with a pretty good compromise. Started in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and I made the yard there in La Crosse actually the visible end of a return loop, which allowed to have some ability to do some switching in La Crosse, but also serve the purpose for staging at the same time. There's the station in La Crosse that's full sized, and then we cross the Mississippi River. Now, I think we both, when we started this, had some fantasies that we'd do the whole Mississippi River in full size, but there are actually at that point sort of 4 channels, 4 different bridges. It's almost 2 miles from where it leaves Wisconsin shores to being firmly on the ground in I think it's Minnesota at that point. So we had to scale back our ambitions a little bit, but he still should be able to have some pretty impressive bridges crossing the Mississippi there. Goes around this way, up a helix, only 2 1/4 turns, which is not too bad, and then comes out on the upper deck, and let's see, yeah, continuing this way and on into the beautifully named Pig's Eye yard outside of St. Paul. And then I used another John Armstrong trick of what he called the reverted loop to squeeze some staging back into the corner here for the upper track as well. So that one worked out pretty well. Did maintain a nice, comfortable 4-foot aisle where most of the operation is going to be done around the yard here, which I think will work relatively well. And the staging is actually more accessible than it looks here because of the ceiling heights and the way those work. So it is possible to get to that staging. This one I like because of its simplicity and its the relative lack of ambition of the designer. He had a fair amount of room, and this is how a lot of prototype plans start, I think, in that this is the route he used to commute on in California, and it's out to the far east of Los Angeles, up into the hills, and he used to drive this highway that paralleled a a branch line of the BNSF that's apparently the San Jacinto branch. And so he said, I'd just like to sort of model what I saw every day for years and years while I commuted. So it was nice because, like I say, it was pretty unambitious. There's some good industry along the way, and commuter rail, which is fairly recent, but really no need to turn a train around because the commuter rail, of course, was push pull, and all the freights were just locals. So we could have just a nice visible staging yard there. And all of this stuff is nicely in order. There's one commuter station. There's a little sort of shifting yard there, transfer terminal, team track, spur to the city's granite gravel operation, a milling company, another commuter yard there in Paris, and the sort of the end of the commuter line in South Paris. Had to switch this to the wrong side of the tracks, but that's how it goes. And a nice big lumber yard there, which was about where he'd get off the highway. So even though this one goes on a little bit further, it's kind of Lance Mendenheim-ish because most of the stuff that's there is full size, and a lot of room to stretch out. This is a monster I just finished. It is based on a town called Effingham, Illinois, which is where the ICG crossed over the Conrail. Still does with its successor railroads. And this is a gentleman named Mark Nolan in Nashville, who is fairly well known for his large Lehigh Valley Railroad that he is going to rip down and build this thing instead. So he's a quick builder, and he's got quite a team down there. So I think he can do it, but he certainly raised some eyebrows when he decided to start over. But this was a very, especially the Illinois Central Gulf was a very busy stretch of railroad at the era that he was modeling. So he really wanted to get the sense of all of these different railroads coming together in Effingham. And so we've got what's almost a 4-level monstrosity here, and did some things that I wouldn't have chosen to do. This is the garage where the helixes live, but that's his choice and his idea, and he's had staging yards out there up to now, so it's not so bad, and it certainly got them out of my way. So so that was fine. So this is the north end of actually this massive staging yard serves as both the north and the south ends of the primary ICG route. The track appears here in DuQuoin, Illinois, heads north always being to the right. And I'll point out that we've got a branch line here at DuQuoin, which is functional. It just goes around the corner and links right back up with the staging. So doesn't go much of anywhere, but it allows some good operating variety. Next level up, sort of, is the main ICG layout, and heads up through Centralia, Illinois, where there's a lot of industry. Following this way, still going north. This little sneak away helix here leads to the Freeport branch, substandard radius, but again allows some variety in traffic. Continues this way, very narrow shelves here, but we're just making up distance. Some junctions into Edgewood, and finally up into the south end of Effingham. We've got a little drop leaf industry here that and this junction here is as it is in the prototype, heads off to what ICG called the high dry line, because it was had so many bridges and things to keep it out of the flood zones. That's a drop leaf, so most of the time it's out of the way of operators on the main ICG route, but when necessary can be brought up into speed. So here's Effingham and the diamonds where ICG crossed Conrail, and ICG disappears off into a helix, which leads back down to the staging loops that you saw before. And then this is Conrail coming the other way. And as I mentioned, it's really difficult to get a functioning junction and make it accessible. That's thusly the helixes in the garage, and you've still got some pretty decent reaches here, but hopefully they won't be needed too often. So Conrail is heading off east from Effingham and jumps to another deck. So by this point, this has all come up in level so that Effingham is pretty near chest height, I think, at that point. And then we go to the rest of the Conrail route, which goes on climbing here up to Terre Haute and disappears into another sort of staging yard come classification yard representing the Avon yards in Indianapolis. And then when Conrail goes through Effingham and disappears this way, it heads to another staging, which is carefully set in between the big staging for the ICG and the main line there. And then, but wait, there's more. This is the high dry line coming off of that drop leaf Y that I showed you. There's a big power plant at Newton, going up here through Robinson, Palestine, and this is going to be way up in the air, 70 inches high, one of the long trestles that was part of the high dry line, and this is full size, so it's going to be up above eye level and should be pretty impressive sight. And then finally into some staging that represents Indianapolis and hangs up over Effingham in the Valence. So definitely lost some hair trying to get that one to happen. And we'll let you know how it works out. Not all of them are quite that big. This is one I just finished, sort of general Wisconsin prototype, very small bedroom. So, but he still had a big roundhouse he wanted to use and wanted intermodal. And so we wanted to go for something that had relatively broad curves, was able to keep them to 28. And the staging's a little complicated, but for a small railroad, got some pretty long staging tracks in. The helixes actually go in opposite directions this way and then come together, do a sort of a semi-helix to stay out of the way of the turnouts that are underneath, finally get to visible traffic, and then there's his full-sized Walther's 130-foot terminal and some intermodal space and a half-decent freight yard and things like that before it disappears back underground. So that is what I have. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. I'm certainly willing to take any questions that you might have. And I clearly have thrilled Ernie Little with this presentation.
Yeah. You got a question from Phil Taylor in the chat. Have you ever planned narrow gauge?
Let's see. Yes, I have. Yeah, let's see. If you're interested. There's one, the plan itself was pretty simple. Let me see if I can find it, because it was sort of based around a guy who had built a whole bunch of craftsman kits, and it really took a lot of room. But I was pretty pleased with how it came out. I'm trying to remember his name. Any other questions while I'm looking to see if I can put my finger on that one? That is not it.
Bill, do you want to ask a question?
Sure. I was noticing the charts of figuring out how big a train needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
I was reminded that a couple of friends, Keith Stillman and Bob Reed, had an interesting strategy for this. Rather than set their railroads in the golden age, the 50s, they set their railroads in the 20s. The payoff for this is suddenly you're not talking 40-foot boxcars, but 36-foot boxcars. And suddenly everything's just a little bit smaller.
Yeah.
And you can be bigger and smaller at the same time. Comments?
Well, that's certainly something that I've enjoyed as I do the Ma and Pa, which ran those, 35-foot cars into the 60s, although I'm modeling 1924, but I have a 27-inch minimum radius and it looks wonderful. I have a helix on the railroad, and I was worried about my little steamers going up and down steep grades, but then I realized that it didn't need to be nearly as tall as it would be for a modern railroad where you're trying to run double stacks and auto cars and like that. So if you're the type that enjoys building a fair amount of your own stuff, then it can be a great way to go.
Now, Jill, do you have a question?
It's like Nigel's got his hand up. Although he's muted, so I don't know if he has a question or not.
I'll unmute myself. Hi, Bob. Thanks very much for an illuminating talk. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you very much.
When you do the planning on the curves, seemed to me that you actually had a fair number of curves with changing radii on the plans. And I was just wondering, do you allow for easements on curves of different radii? And certainly curves that go into a straight. So I'm just wondering if it wasn't very clear from the plans that if you actually make allowances for easements. So after that, I do have a comment that I'd like to make.
Sure, and the answer is that I don't draw easements. And part of the reason is that, and John Armstrong pointed this out, so I've used it as an excuse ever since, is that the lines of the track are actually wider than an easement would be anyway. And same goes for parallel tracks in HO scale. It's very convenient to design them 2 inches apart, but unless you're doing the Ma and Pa or something like it, you'd better allow another 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch for overhang in those cases. And I usually put that in the show notes rather than trying to design it into the plan, unless it's a really small plan. Like if somebody's got, an 18-inch curve and there's a parallel curve, I will draw it at, 20 and 1/4 inches or something like that, because they might be printing it big enough to have that make a difference. I do leave room for easements in the sense that, and this is again something that's very painful, is you can't butt a turn up right to the point where a curve would start, because you've got to leave at least 4 inches or so for the tracks to straighten out in an easement. So I do my best to leave, from the point that the tangent would join the circle, to leave 3 to 4 inches before the switch points, so that so that an easement can be made to work there. And
Okay,
you know, I've
right.
found out the hard way that it's a good idea to do that.
Yeah. I have a comment about, I was really intrigued by your list of, I suppose you would call them planning resources, which a couple there I wasn't aware of, so something new for me. One of the things I've recently been finding, so I'm doing a little layout somewhere around about 1912, where a lot of the Google type software is not going to be applicable. And that is that the USGS maps from that era tend to be somewhat optimistic, I'd use, in terms of where the track is and how many tracks are there. So often you find a representation of one track, and then after a bit of research, you realize that there's actually more than one track there. So one of the other resources that I find very useful, it's not comprehensive by any means, and it is restricted to up to about 1926 or so, are the Sanborn insurance maps, which tend to be fairly accurate. And actually, oftentimes we show that where the USGS map has got one line, there were maybe 3 lines or even 4 lines when you go to an insurance map, which is quite accurate. And the other thing is that, or the other comment I have is that there's a resource out there called Templot, which is probably not workable on a map, on a Mac, I'm not quite sure, but it's a piece of software that is 100% dedicated to track design and allows you to do anything and everything. And I'm serious, I mean anything and everything, all the way to specifying the width of the foot of the rail, and that's very useful. So for those who are not familiar with it, I do recommend it. It's actually free, which is unusual in this day and age, and I find it indispensable for track planning. But again, if you're way back in the anywhere up to 1926 or so, the Sanborn maps can be extremely useful in terms of where the buildings were, where the track was, and where the sidings were, and so on. So, but again, thank you very much for a very, very illuminating talk. Well done.
You're welcome, and thanks for that comment, because it gave me time to find the one I was looking for. I'll show you real quick, and then let's see, do I have it? Yeah, this is off my website, so it's a little might be a little tricky to see. Can you see that all right? This is narrow gauge, and has some of the this is a big what's his name, South River Model Works. No, it's not South River Model Works, it's the other one. Anyway, big Craftsman kit and a logging camp up there and this kind of thing. So yes, I have done some narrow gauge, and can be fun. Okay, well, I've enjoyed this. I hope it was useful, and I'm certainly accessible for any questions if I can help with anything. And thank you for joining me. I had the website is bobstrackplans.com if you want any of those resources or anything like that. Feel free to dive in and let me know what you think. And with that, I'll oops, let's see, do I have a chat I need to BTS? Yeah, I'm not sure that's right, but anyway, thanks all. Have a great afternoon, great Father's Day, happy Juneteenth, and see you at the next event.
Bob, thanks a lot for presenting the clinic. Everybody have a good day. We'll sign off here, and everybody stay healthy. We'll see you next month.